So, in this video I'm going to give a little bit of background on Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm just going to go for the larger picture, so if you're looking for sources and citations, you'll find some of those in the description. The first thing to know is that Shakespeare and his father were both very heavily invested in the concept of legacy. Which a lot of people in those days were, but Shakespeare's father, William Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, was a particularly ambitious man, and in 1560s or 70s he had applied for a coat of arms, which was very important. It would allow, it would turn somebody into a gentleman, allow them to carry a sword, that sort of important thing. And one thing that was very important about the coat of arms is that it was passed down from father to son. In those days, girls were not carriers of legacy. What was very important was the name and being able to inherit. And so a girl's function, a woman's function, was to be sold as a womb so that a man could have a child that would carry his name. And Shakespeare had 3 children. He had 2 daughters and a son. So he had one son, which was the only child who would be able to carry his name on. And unfortunately for Shakespeare, Hamlet, his son, died at age 11. It's suspected that it was of bubonic plague. There's some speculation as to other things, but the bottom line is that Shakespeare's son died at age 11, and Shakespeare was devastated. A comment is made on the Wikipedia page that it's interesting that one of the other poets of the time is well known for making a tribute to his son in poetry, and that if Shakespeare had done it, it would have been more subtle. The interesting thing from my point of view is that Shakespeare then, after his son's death, poured everything that he had, and for the remaining days of his life, worked on these sonnets, and turned the sonnets into a tribute and a memorial to his son and to his legacy and to himself, effectively. And what the sonnets are is one of the most beautiful, the sonnet sequence is one of the most beautiful and one of the most tragic pieces of writing in the history of English literature. And it's precisely because of that. And so Shakespeare's sonnets were published in 1609. It's the only work of Shakespeare's that he published. All the rest of his plays, all of the rest of his work, which is his plays, were predominantly collected by, people who were interviewing actors and writing down their lines that they'd remembered. But the sonnets were the real work of his. They form his portfolio. And so he published the sonnets, and along with the sonnets, a poem called A Lover's Complaint, which is effectively a description of the experience of reading the sonnets. And it's, aside from the fact that it's the only thing that he'd ever published himself, it's also the only work of Shakespeare's that went largely unmentioned in history. There's no mention of criticism. It's very hard to find evidence of people even buying it, and people just don't talk about it. And so about 30 years, roughly 30 years after Shakespeare published the sonnets, to thunderous silence, a man came and republished the sonnets amongst a bunch of other poetry. He reordered the sonnets and he changed the pronouns so that it wouldn't be to a young man, or, because that was a terrible thing in those days. And that, for the next 100 or so years, became the definitive version of Shakespeare's sonnets. So everybody who read them read a very different poem. And then, as I said, about 100 years later, somebody came and figured out what the correct sequence was, what the original published sonnets were. And ever since then, they've been analyzed and loved, especially by scholars in universities and so on. But they haven't really been appreciated by regular people, which was Shakespeare's target market. If you look at all of the plays and how he operated, but they've also all been analyzed based on this initial misunderstanding generated by, or hinted at by, the republishing, which is that these sonnets were missives or love letters to a younger male lover and to an unattractive woman. Effectively, the mysteriousness, the mystery of Shakespeare's sonnets and why they are so incomprehensible and seemingly incoherent has been because they are being analyzed with an assumption that this is what they're about. And I think the reason why I arrived at the understanding that I have of how to read the sonnets is because I didn't come with these preconceptions, even if I'd been told about them, because something had been bothering me about how they were written. And so if you read them knowing, with the understanding that this is a very sad mourning poem, that it is a poem of love, real love for oneself and one, it becomes very clear for a simple reading without any extra layers of interpretation, weird things, weird ways of connecting things. It's a very straightforward, beautiful poem. And in fact, and I may have said this before, but I really do believe it is one of the most beautiful things that has ever been written in the English language. And so that's a very important thing to understand when approaching the sonnets, is what they are. We always ask questions when we talk about sonnets. Who are they written to? Who are they written from? And in this case, they weren't written to some, aristocrat or noble or patron or, to a lover. It was written to himself. It was written to his son. It was written to the concept of love for oneself and one's son and the idea of legacy going forward. So that's the first thing that one needs to understand when approaching the sonnets. The second thing that one needs to understand is that Shakespeare was very heavily influenced by Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this has been well established in the literature, and there's plenty of references throughout the plays. This sonnet sequence that he produced, in particular, is precisely framed by Arthur Golding's translation of the story of Narcissus and Echo. And it is the story, the single thread that connects the entire chain, is that it is the story of Narcissus falling in love with his reflection in the water, and then later on, Echo, the reflection's conversation with Echo, who is the only witness to this love now that the actual Narcissus has died. So that may sound a little weird, but it becomes much clearer going forward how this thing works. And so there are plenty of references. I was going to drop a few references in this video, but I've decided to create a separate file, which I will link to in the description of this video as soon as it's finished being compiled. But I've already got quite a lot of references where Shakespeare is directly quoting from Narcissus and Echo. So if you don't have if you're not familiar with that story, with that version and that language of Narcissus and Echo, you're going to miss out on a whole lot of what's going on in the sonnets. And so that's really the most important stuff to understand when approaching the sonnets. So that'll be the end of this video, and in the next video in the series, I will begin discussing the first sonnet and what's actually going on. So hopefully you'll be willing to pay for the bonus material. Some of it will be funny, some of it might be a little bit embarrassing for me. So please support my Patreon. It'll get these videos made, it'll get the graphic novel made much quicker, and it will also give you access to live streaming of me hurting myself while getting Shakespeare's sonnets tattooed onto my body, as well as a bunch of other bonus material that I'm sure you will find entertaining. Thank you.